On this week's 51%, the month of June is Gun Violence Awareness Month. Our associate producer Jody Cowan speaks with Jaclyn Schildkraut of the Regional Gun Violence Research Consortium about how the country's mass shooting epidemic is impacting schools and what needs to be done to disrupt the cycle.
We need to stop just moving on so fast, especially when people can't move on. Support can't just be thoughts and prayers. Support has to be followed by action.
I'm Jessie King. It's all up next on 51%.
I was standing around like one of those girls I had seen in a movie. The whole world was a movie back then. I had my sunglasses on, I wanted to be seen without seeing shy Lolita. I wasn't really in it, I didn't really get it.
You're listening to 51%, a WAMC production dedicated to women's issues and experiences. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Jessie King. There's a lot going on in the month of June. Of course, it's Pride Month, and we're working on a roundup of conversations around gender and sexuality to air over the course of this month. Juneteenth, recognizing the emancipation of enslaved African Americans, is on June 19th. But we're going to spend this episode talking about a day that I was not aware of until recently, and unfortunately, no, it's not fun. For advocates of gun reform, June is thought of as Gun Violence Awareness Month. And this year they're wearing orange and recognizing National Gun Violence Awareness Day on June 2nd. Gun violence, as we've all heard, has become an epidemic in the United States. In 2021, more Americans died of gun-related injuries than in any other year on record, according to the CDC. There's no official consensus on what is considered a mass shooting, but according to the online database Gun Violence Archive, there have been 268 mass shootings so far this year as of this taping, leading many experts to believe the U.S. is on pace to set a horrible record for 2023. It's changed the way many of us feel in public, regardless of our gender or race, and sparked panic in frequent targets like schools. But at the same time, it's fueled a stifling partisan debate about America's love affair with guns and how we should address the crisis moving forward. Our main guest today has been studying gun violence and mass shootings from a statistical, numbers-based lens for roughly 15 years. Jaclyn Schildkraut is an associate professor of criminal justice at SUNY Oswego and the author of several books on the subject. Earlier this year, she became the executive director of the Regional Gun Violence Research Consortium. She spoke with our associate producer, Jody Cowan, about how the issue is particularly impacting children in our schools and what she feels can be done to disrupt the cycle.
Unfortunately, we do know that, as infrequently as they do happen or as statistically rare as they are, mass shootings are increasing in frequency. We know that other forms of gun violence are also increasing in frequency. And continuing to not address the root causes of why people pick up firearms in the first place is going to lead this to continue to happen. So, certainly, I think one of the challenges as a nation that we face is there tends to be a lot of response or reactivity, right? So in my field, where I look at mass shootings, we have the same reaction every time one happens, right? Thoughts and prayers and how did this happen? And we don't understand. But if you actually look into all of the individuals who are committing these acts, they're all pretty much doing the exact same thing over and over and over again. And so, it's kind of that old adage that, if you keep doing the same thing and expecting it to change, that's kind of the definition of insanity, right? We have to focus more on being proactive and less reactive. The response is still important, but we need to be doing more to prevent it from happening in the first place.
To compare maybe to the automobile industry, after so many crashes resulted in death and preventable injury, seatbelts were instated and required federal oversight. A lot of the federal oversight we're getting today in regards to firearms seems to make it easier for people to become victims of gun violence. What do you think is happening there?
Yeah, it's such a complex problem. And I think that the challenge is the majority of Americans agree on, and I hate to use the word common sense, but some generalized principles that can help make gun violence more difficult. Things like universal background checks, right? So 90% of citizens in the United States, regardless of whether you're a man or a woman, or white or a person of color, regardless of whether you're a gun owner or not, regardless of whether you're even an NRA member or not, roughly 90% of our country agrees on universal background checks. Like, nobody has a problem with that. But the challenge is that our legislators are not following the will of the people, right? Because if they were, we would have universal background checks. I think the other issue that kind of complicates this is that guns are so ingrained in our country's culture and history that there doesn't seem to be a way to disentangle that or to bring people from both sides to the table to say, do you agree that people should be able to go to the supermarket or to school without being shot? You agree as well? Okay, great. Let's start there. And so the challenge is that you have this really large moderate on both sides that agree with that sentiment, but then you have these really small fringes or outliers on both sides who are making the most noise. And so I think there's just got to be a way to find out where this middle ground is, because many gun owners in this country support safe gun safety. And that's what it boils down to. They don't have a problem with safe storage. They don't have a problem with training and licensing. But the fringes are what is creating the most noise and pulling the dialogue away from that center where compromise could be reached.
I was raised in the late 80s in a home that had no guns and was really against gun violence, but I was exposed to firearms through, riflery classes at summer camp and family members that were into hunting. Fast forward to today, and I still have no guns in my home, but YouTube and video games and news headlines, are bringing the exposure to my children. Is there anything that any one of us can do to avoid proximity to gun violence?
Oh, wow. I wish I knew, to be perfectly honest. I think to your point about the exposure to your children is the fact that, again, guns are not just weapons for self-protection in our country. They become fetishized. They become part of our entertainment, right? We've seen episodes of very high-rated shows involve episodes of mass shootings. Again, it's become very ingrained in our culture where it's hard to kind of take that fantasy and reality and separate them. As somebody who grew up in the Parkland community where we had obviously a very high profile mass shooting back in 2018 and lost 17 members of our community. And I also went to college in Orlando where Pulse was, where we lost 49 members of our community. How you avoid that, I do not know, because the reality is that gun violence can happen anywhere at any time in the safest communities, not necessarily mass shootings. We know that family gun violence or domestic gun violence is an issue. We know that gun violence in conjunction with crimes like robberies and assaults is common. So, I don't know how you eliminate your risk, because the reality is the risk will always be there, even if you were sitting at home all day, every day. I think the most important thing is to recognize, and I'm speaking at this from the context of mass public shootings, these are still very, very rare events, and we can't live our lives in fear of what if. So when I go somewhere, I don't sit there and stare at the door wondering when somebody with an AR-15 is coming in. I'm aware of my surroundings. I, know what I would do if somebody did come in with an AR-15. Of course, having training and executing in practice are two totally different things. But I always just kind of do quick scan, set a plan. I make sure I'm just aware of my surroundings. I know where my exits are, and then I go on and I enjoy my life.
And to that point, you actually wrote the book on school lockdown drills. What was it like sitting down to write this book?
I've been working in this space since the Parkland shooting. I have had an amazing opportunity to partner with New York's fifth largest school district, Syracuse City School District. When I came in, they didn't really have a solid plan. Everybody was doing something different. Obviously, in emergency response, you want as standardized of a response as possible because it makes it easier for first responders. It makes it easier for the people in the building. So I had a really unique opportunity to work with a school district of this size, because it's 20,000 kids and 4,300 employees, including embedded community partners. But then to really look at, what does this do? How does it make people more prepared? How does it make them feel? Because, what's interesting about this space is since Columbine, the number of schools across America doing lockdown drills has continued to increase to the point of where effectively we have 95% of public K-12 schools, of which there are over 100,000 in this nation, doing these practices. But the reality is there was no research on it. So you had 95% of schools doing something without knowing if it worked. And so that's where we've been really fortunate to put a lot of research in a really short amount of time behind these practices to say, look, we have a $3+ billion a year school safety industry where everybody's trying to sell you something, none of which has any evidence behind it of their effectiveness. But here's a free solution that has practical utility both in and out of school that can actually save your life. So yeah, I think, I'd love to say writing the book was hard. It really wasn't, because the research really spoke for itself.
One thing I was surprised to read about in your book was finding there's a difference between an active shooter drill and a lockdown drill, with many schools looking to do away with active shooter drills. Can you clarify some of the differences between the two drills?
Yeah, so a lockdown is a tool that can be used for any danger that's inside of a building. It's not necessarily an active shooter, though that's what we talk about it with most synonymously. So, we've seen stories in the news, like in the Pacific Northwest, of like a moose getting into a school. You don't want a kid interacting with a giant moose any more than you want them to be interacting with a person with a gun, right? The whole point of a lockdown is that you're creating time and distance between you and a threat. And one of the things that we know from all of the active shooter events or mass shootings that have happened in schools is the number one life-saving device is a door lock, right? It creates that barrier. They don't have time to defeat it. And so most of the time, if you're behind a locked door, you're safe. The challenge with active shooter drills, and I was talking with a colleague about this morning, is the term active shooter drill has been co-opted to mean the drills that have gone bad, right? So there's been news stories of like teachers being shot with pellet guns and kids being exposed to crisis actors covered in fake blood and sounds of simulated gunfire and all of these other, sort of sensorial techniques that defy every piece of logic in terms of how you mitigate trauma during one of these practices. But in reality, those situations are not even actually drills, they're simulations. The whole goal of drills is to develop muscle memory. And what that means is, like, if you're in a stressful situation and your brain just sort of shuts down, as is humanly natural for us to do, your body will kind of go on autopilot and do what you've trained it to do. And so that's why we practice. And, one of the things we always tell people when we're doing this is you practice like you play. So, we don't want to be like not taking it seriously. And people, when I run drills, they know, like, I'm not messing around with you. Like, we're going to do this and we're going to do this right, but we're not going to simulate it or make you scared. I just need you to take it seriously.
Do you feel hope ever that things will get better before they get worse?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I always, maybe it's sort of pie in the sky. I always have hope because I think the minute we lose that, then all of the people that we lost were lost for no reason. And I also think that all the perpetrators win. And I think, no matter what, our country didn't get to where it was overnight, and it's not going to get fixed overnight. And I recognize that. There was a shooting at the YouTube headquarters. I believe it was 2018. It might have been 2018, but it might have been 2016. I was working that day and I had the news feed up on Facebook. And I remember seeing a comment from this woman, and I will never forget this. She said, "Well, I guess we should have expected it. It's been a couple weeks." And I think when you have that mentality, you've given up hope and you've just accepted that this is who we are. And I just refuse to do that because I think our country deserves better. Your children and all of the children out there deserve better, and their future children deserve better. And so I'm not willing to give up in the hopes that somehow even little old me can make a difference. And I think if more people thought like that, we'd probably get further.
Jaclyn, any final thoughts?
This is what I would like to end on is I think it's very easy for us, because this becomes so overwhelming, to change the channel. And while I hate to use this word, and I know so many people will hate this word as well, being able to say, I can't handle this anymore and change the channel is privilege. And there's so many people in my community, in communities across this country, who don't get to change the channel, that when the news cameras move on to the next shooting or the next story, they're still there trying to pick up the pieces. So I would encourage, not that we have to dwell in this, sort of realm of misery, but to remember that there are people who still need our help and our support, and that they don't get to just move on. And so, I have connected with folks from Uvalde, and every day they're down there fighting just to have their kids remembered. Students, well, I guess they were students at the time from our community, launched March for Our Lives because they were sick of the adults not doing anything. There's so many people who still need our support. And I think that we need to stop just moving on so fast, especially when people can't move on. Again, I'm not suggesting that we dwell, but support can't just be thoughts and prayers. Support has to be followed by action.
That was Jaclyn Schildkraut, Executive Director of the Regional Gun Violence Research Consortium, speaking with our associate producer, Jody Cowan. We're going to switch gears now to bring you stories of women in broader public service and the issues that are important to them, starting with the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the federal government. Of the 86 people who have served as U.S. Attorney General throughout our nation's history, only 2 of them have been women. 3 if you count Sally Yates, who served as acting attorney general for just 10 days at the beginning of former President Donald Trump's administration, but otherwise those two are Loretta Lynch and Janet Reno. Reno served for 8 years under former President Bill Clinton from 1993 to 2001, making her not only the first woman to take the job, but the second longest person to hold the post. Those 8 years, and the 15 years she spent as a state attorney in Florida, were all but smooth sailing for Reno, who started her tenure with the deadly standoffs and siege of the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas, and wrapped it after years grappling with investigations surrounding the Clinton administration. Reno died of Parkinson's in 2016, but a new biography looks back on her storied career. Judith Hicks Stiehm, professor emerita of political science at Florida International University and a former colleague of Reno, got access to her personal diaries, family papers, and photos for her new book, Janet Reno, A Life. Unfortunately, Stiehm ended up not being in the best health to speak with me in time for broadcast today, but her daughter, journalist Jamie Stiehm, has worked closely alongside her mother with her books and was on hand to highlight a work that was near and dear to her mother's heart.
When Janet Reno was in the room, you knew it. She was very unusual here in Washington because she was very much an outsider for 8 years, and she never tried to be on the inside. She didn't care about being an outsider because, in a way, she was all her life. You know, there were very few women at Harvard Law School when she was a student there. So she had a tremendous sense of self, and that led her to make some unpopular decisions that she felt were right.
Now, when she first took the job, though, in 1993, she got hit with some really big stuff, right away. I want to ask a little bit about what happened in Waco, Texas, because that ended up being, one of the biggest moments, I think, of her tenure.
You're right on about that, Jessie. That was a tremendous tragedy. The Branch Davidians were kind of in a standoff for a long, long time. And she made the very hard decision to go in. The people inside refused to surrender, and so there was a loss of life, which she regretted, to the end of her days. That marked her, first really landmark decision as Attorney General. And President Clinton left the decision to her. And she did make the point that some law enforcement were wounded and killed also in the standoff. And she had to testify before Congress about it, and she took full responsibility. And because she did, she became the most popular member of President Clinton's cabinet.
What were some of the other biggest events of her tenure as Attorney General?
I'll mention two very tough junctures for her. One was Elian Gonzalez. The other people who were trying to make it over to Florida were all drowned, and he was the only survivor. He was found floating in the sea by the Coast Guard, and the Cuban relatives of Elian wanted to keep him in Miami and not return him to his father in Cuba. And Janet Reno is from Miami, so she was very familiar with the Cuban community. They were part of her political base. And after so many agonizing interviews and immigration investigations, it was decided that the father had first claim to him and he should be returned to his father. But yet it involved going into a private residence of his Cuban relatives and taking the child and sending him back to Cuba. And she went against, all her allies in Miami to make that decision. Attorney General Reno could never be accused of doing the expedient thing, the easy thing for her party or her president, because she appointed a special counsel, Kenneth Starr, to investigate the president's real estate transaction back in Arkansas before he came to Washington. So that led eventually to a very winding road to an affair that President Clinton had with a young employee at the Pentagon, Monica Lewinsky. And that became a full-blown scandal, and the House of Representatives decided to impeach him for that. So she took an unpopular step in doing that, making that appointment that turned out to be so troublesome for her president, but she did it, and she stood by it.
Looking back at her career, what would you say her legacy is as Attorney General?
Compared to Attorney Generals that have come since, she has shown a real light on doing the right thing and standing for being the nation's lawyer, not the president's lawyer. You may remember that Robert Barr marched through a demonstration with President Clinton that was a protest, and that was linking him very much to the president's politics. And Janet Reno would not have done such a thing. She liked to separate herself from the politics of the moment or the day and with the people and with the law, which she knew very well. And she really never wavered from that vision.
Jamie Stiehm is a journalist in Washington, D.C., speaking for her mother, Judith Hicks Stiehm, about her biography on U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno, called simply Janet Reno, A Life. It's out now through the University of Florida Press. Here in New York, the sun is setting on the legislative session. Issues like the state budget, criminal justice reform, and housing have dominated the session so far. But even in the final days, advocates have been taking to the state capitol in Albany to push for the issues nearest to them. As New York Public Media's Capitol correspondent Karen DeWitt reports, survivors of sexual harassment want to see a bill passed that would ban most forms of non-disclosure agreements. The survivors, who include several women who worked at Fox News, say the current law has loopholes that protect sexual predators.
Former Fox News anchor Gretchen Carlson came to the Capitol along with other survivors of sexual harassment to lobby for the bill. Carlson successfully sued the former head of Fox News, the late Roger Ailes, for harassment and retaliation, but she had to sign a non-disclosure agreement as part of a settlement. Even though the incident has been widely reported in the media and was even the subject of a Hollywood movie, she's not allowed to talk about it.
My story may be public, but I have been silenced by an NDA, prohibiting me from ever disclosing what really happened.
Carlson says the NDAs have become epidemic in the American workplace, with 1/3 of new employees required to sign one before they begin their first day of work. Carlson, who since co-founded the survivors advocacy group Lift Our Voices, says the NDAs protect sexual predators.
The bill we're advocating for today would eliminate NDAs, not just for harassment and assault, but for all toxic workplace issues, including race, gender, sexual identity, age, and disability discrimination. This bill puts the power back in the hands of the survivors.
The measure, called the Stop Silencing Survivors Act, comes at a time when 2 members of the state assembly have been accused of harassment, and Governor Hochul recently severed ties with a top political advisor, Adam Sullivan, over allegations that he fostered a toxic work environment and was demeaning to younger women on the governor's staff. In 2018, New York State reformed laws dealing with sexual harassment in the workplace, including NDAs. But advocates say the current statutes are flawed. Employee attorney Margaret McIntyre says the victims are no longer required to sign NDAs unless they state that it is their preference to enter into one. But she says that change has not stopped employers from continuing to pressure survivors to agree.
The law doesn't work because still today, employers say, well, if you want to settle your case, you will prefer to keep things confidential. That's just the reality.
Senate sponsor of the bill, Andrew Gennardis, says the measure would restore NDAs to their original purpose, to allow an employer to protect trade secrets and other proprietary information. That would still be allowed. And victims who want privacy would still be able to choose to keep their identities and the circumstances around the complaint secret. He says under the current rules, though, the NDAs are misused.
What we're talking about here is banning a bribe. You are bribing someone to keep their mouth shut about the harms that they have done to you.
The bill is currently in the Senate and Assembly Judiciary Committees. No date has yet been scheduled for a vote. In Albany, I'm Karen DeWitt.
Thank you, Karen. And finally, nail techs have also been taking up shop in the New York State Capitol to drum up support for a bill that would help set minimum standards for salons across the state. Like many workers in the remnants of the Great Resignation, employees of New York salons are calling for better working conditions and higher pay. But they say they can't get there without a proper seat at the table. Again, we'll throw it to our associate producer, Jody Cowan, who stopped by a recent rally to learn more.
Filling up the million-dollar staircase of the New York State Capitol, nail salon workers joined organizers from the New York State Healthy Nail Salons Coalition to demand reform for what they say is an industry in crisis. Citing a 2022 report from Cornell University that took an in-depth look at the unjust labor practices prevalent in New York State nail salons, advocates highlighted that intense competition among salons and a lack of uniform standards for pay, health, or safety have led to the state's nail salon industry being placed in freefall. Workers' wages are being driven further and further down, while lack of oversight threatens to put responsible nail salon operators out of business. In New York's nail industry, many salon workers who are often AAPI women and Latina are forced to endure dangerous working conditions, low pay, and exploitation across the state. Shweta Takali, a nail technician and member leader of the Nepali-speaking advocacy group Adhikar, spoke to her experience working in a New York City nail salon for the last decade. Atish Garon, communications coordinator for Adhikar, translates.
I've been working as a nail salon worker for more than 10 years, and I've been continually working in this industry, and I've been working long, but it's not good enough. For us, even with the PPE and the gloves and the mask that we need to work in the nail salon hasn't been provided by the employer way before COVID, and even with COVID, once the pandemic started, then we had to use more stronger and more toxic chemicals. But even with that, the owner hasn't still provided us the PPE. I for myself, I take PPE from my home to use at work. And I would love to work in this nail salon industry for a long time, but there's no protection for the retirement, and there's no pension that we can rely on, even though we are a professional worker because we need license in order to practice as a nail salon worker.
Takali and her colleagues say the Nail Salon Minimum Standards Council Act, which was reintroduced this year by State Senator Jessica Ramos and Assemblymember Harry Bronson, would give workers a seat at the table alongside lawmakers and small business owners to discuss new health and safety standards across the industry. Speaking at the press conference, Ramos, a Democrat, pledged her full support of the bill.
We cannot wait for this industry to make these fixes on their own. Unfortunately, many nail salon owners who are immigrants themselves, who are small business owners, make a living or make a profit off the backs of these workers who are exposing themselves day in and day out. On top of that, sometimes they're even stealing their salary or their overtime pay. And it is time we put an end to that.
The act would also appoint an independent committee of experts to implement a fair, minimum pricing model for all nail services. Ramos says this would help boost sustainable industry practices by providing the resources necessary for every operator in the state to comply with the standards. According to Cornell University's report, despite current and rising state standards for minimum wage, some employers are simply not complying. Workers noted that often, even when employers did comply, the benefit of a boost in wages was canceled out by reductions in work hours as well as the rising cost of living. Assemblymember Bronson, also a Democrat, spoke to the impassioned crowd of nail techs and their supporters, but called for better standards for all workers in New York State, especially for those that find themselves most likely to be exploited.
Lifting everybody up so that we're getting a fair minimum wage, we're getting work environments that are safe. We cannot allow workers in a particular industry to be abused and to not get the kind of wages and the safety that they need in the work environment. And I'm happy to work with my good friend, Senator Ramos, to make sure we get this passed this year. Thank you.
The push for the bill continues as organizers plan for more rallies and workshops across the state. New York's legislative session ends on June 8th. For 51%, I'm Jody Cowan.
That's a wrap on this week's 51%. 51% is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio in Albany, New York. It's produced and hosted by me, Jesse King. Our associate producer is Jody Cowan, and our theme is Lolita by the Albany-based artist Girl Blue. Just a reminder that you can listen to 51% anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or wherever you get your podcasts. On social media, we're at WAMC Radio, and you can stay in the loop by signing up for our weekly newsletter, Airwaves, at WAMC.org. We hope you'll join us next week. Until then, I'm Jesse King for 51%.
I was every single girl, I was nobody else, I was so sure of myself. I was 15 and a half, he was a hollow laugh. And I lost my cool somewhere along the way. The nightmare down the hallway, I had to learn how to look away. I it all.